Teachers of Reddit, what's the most heartbreaking thing you've ever discovered about a student? My wife's story, who is a 3rd grade teacher, had a young boy in class who was deaf. She found out that his parents were M-heads and actually were sticking Q-tips and other things in his ear, causing them to lose hearing. He lives with his grandma now and his parents are in prison. Thankfully, not a lot of crap makes me cry, but every time I think about this it makes me tear up. We went over to their house and me and my wife's brother built a wheelchair ramp for the grandma so she could get her grandkids to school easier. Meeting the little boy made it all the more real. It's truly heartbreaking. I had a student crying hysterically during choir rehearsal. She said her mom wasn't coming to the concert that night because she had a doctor's appointment. She was being sent back to rehab. Mom was a teacher. A few kids came to school in winter repeatedly with no jacket. My mom bought them jackets. Families sold them that night for drug money. 2 of my HS students got cancer. One almost died but recovered fully. A miracle it was. The other became disfigured and spiraled down from there. Another was a triple murderer who now is a lifer. I wish this was my only student who lived with trauma, but it is the most concise. My student came to school with her hair hacked, just chopped in big uneven clumps. She was embarrassed. I asked her privately if she would like for me to help her even it out. When I began helping, I discovered the gouges in her scalp from dad stabbing her with scissors while whacking her hair off. I had a 20-year-old student my first year. He was a tough nut to crack and was frequently an issue for me. He was not a bad student by any means, but he was very inconsistent. He'd miss days on end and then ask for makeup work or extra time. This meant more work for me, and as a new teacher, I tried to hold rigidly to the rules and expectations. Work was due the day it was due, etc. The challenge was amplified by the fact I was only 22 at the time, so it was difficult to manage someone that could conceivably be a peer outside of the classroom. I thought him to be arrogant and really testing my limits, considering he was less than a year away from being ejected for even the smallest issues. In one specific incident, I became very frustrated when he was texting in class and gave me the just a sec gesture when I told him to put the phone away that moment. I lost my cool and got administration involved, as this was probably the 3rd or 4th time I'd had this issue in a week or so. He spends some time with the principal and then I get some time with the principal. Turns out, my annoying near adult student was having an issue of his own. His son, 5, was ill and he was making arrangements with his son's mother to pick him up from school. All those gaps where he didn't come to class, he was taking care of his son or was late getting out of work the night before and slept in by accident. He was trying to finish his diploma so he could get a better job. After that, I took the work, he finished it and just asked that he asked to leave the room if he had to call or text. He graduated in June of 2009, so it's likely his son is now in the same school now. Crazy stuff. Frick yeah dude. A happy ending. Not a teacher but behavior consultant. Kid fell apart behaviorally and academically, and I found out his 2-year-old brother fell while trying to walk outside, hit his head on concrete, and died a couple days later. That'll do it to you. My first tenure track job. There was this girl who wanted to double major and came to my office to see what classes she'd need for her political science degree. I think she had taken intro with me like 2 years prior. She was really quiet and shy, but I thought she was a pretty good student. At the time, I had my 13-month-old in my office occasionally for office hours as my wife works, but can't have a baby in the office. She saw him and started crying uncontrollably. Afterwards, she asked to hold him and of course I let her. Everything was okay. I eventually discovered that she'd been in an amazingly brutal relationship with a domestic abuser. She wanted to have a child more than anything. She was 6 months pregnant when her BF beat her and caused her to lose the baby. Not me but my mum. A 4-year-old in her class had lived all his life surrounded by addicts. He learned that the adults around him got attention when they overdosed, so whenever he was lonely at school he'd copy them and pretend to overdose. Holy heck, that's horrendous. I'm not a teacher anymore, but I served in the Peace Corps in a very small, POP, 3000 town in Eastern Europe, and my job was being an elementary school English teacher. I had grades 2 through 8, ages 7-14. One of the most generally heartbreaking things about my students was how many of them didn't live with their parents. I was shocked when, during a lesson, I asked a class where they would go if they could go anywhere, and the excited answer from a lot of them was to see mama. Many of my students had parents who were working abroad as maids or laborers in Greece or Western Europe, and the kids would live with their grandparents. I had a few students I suspected of having ADHD and tried to talk to my school director about getting help for them, but she was just kind of like, oh, those are bad kids, they live in villages, they don't have a good background. That was pretty heartbreaking because I didn't really think they were bad kids, they just needed a little extra help. Specifically, I had a third grader who would vacillate between being well behaved and interested in class and being loud and disruptive. I couldn't get a read on her, but she hadn't been in my second grade class the year before, so I figured she had moved and was new to the area and was feeling lonely. Then one day, I only found out about this because of a staff meeting later. She simply left school, walked to the bus station, which was a block away, bought a ticket for our region's capital city, and rode the bus there all by herself. Fortunately, at this point someone realized that an 8-year-old should probably not be traveling alone. Police were called, and she was returned home. It turned out that her mother had died and her father had dumped her off with her grandparents so he could be a full-time alcoholic. She was attempting to run away. My mom also served in the Peace Corps in a small Eastern European nation fairly recently, trying to integrate and bring services to disabled populations in villages. Many similar sad stories. Librarian, not a teacher, but we had a teen who would be a regular for a couple of weeks, then be gone for 3 days, then go back to showing up again. Turns out his stepdad would kick him out of the house and then call the police and report him as a runaway, so he'd have to spend 3 days in lockup, just so he wouldn't have to put up his stepson. He was occasionally loud and a bit of a smartass, but it's not like he was out of control or an otherwise terrible kid, just a normal teenager. Eventually, one time when he was kicked out, he tried to rob a gas station, ended up on an ankle bracelet afterwards. We haven't seen him much since then. About a year ago, I was preparing to leave after school and I saw one of my students hanging around on the playground. 13 years old or so. Now, this was a bit odd because I worked late that day and all students should have long left the premises by then. I saw a colleague that was already on the way to get her out, so I left it at that. Later, I asked that colleague what the problem was. Apparently, the girl had nowhere to go. Literally, mom and dad were divorced and both had new partners. This wasn't an easy kid, quite annoying in class and not the brightest, but both parents did not want to come and take her home. They both said, go live with your, and so she didn't have anywhere to go. There was no other family in the country. That crap made me sit silent for a second. I don't know what happened on that particular night, but I do know that she's nowadays following classes in a boarding school and she's doing okay there. I'm a third grade teacher and I have many kids that have really heartbreaking backgrounds. One of them, a 9-year-old boy, her mother abandoned him and his siblings. His father was murdered in front of him and his older brother, in a drug-related crime. Kid lives with his grandmother who will beat his butt on a daily basis. Of course he is not receiving the professional health needs. Another one, a girl this time. She is the oldest of 3 children. Both parents are drug addicts and would violate their children in many ways. One time, the mother went to buy some drugs but she had no money, so she offered her daughter, my student, as a payment. The dealer didn't accept and the mother was beaten up by the women in the neighborhood. My mother had a kid last year who was living with his grandmother. The boy's father shot his mother and then killed himself. This happened when the boy was about 5. Volunteer youth worker. We were doing an activity where each young person drew what they thought heaven was like. There were the usual clouds and angels and sunshines, but one girl had drawn something different. She drew a family on one side of a huge gate and one man on the other side. When I asked her about it, she said the guy on the outside was her dad and he wasn't allowed into heaven because he hanged himself. She told me that her mum and grandma had said she would never see him again, but she planned to sneak to the gates of heaven after she died so she could see him. Not a teacher but volunteer helping teens write essays applying to college. The personal statements are intense. Most important moment of my life was calling CPS to have my abusive father removed from our house. I've already been on my own, so you know I'm an independent student. Since I was 14, my wages from my part-time job have helped my mom make rent, so I know how to safeguard the money you're going to give me for this scholarship. I was too young to hold a proper knife, but grandma gave me a screwdriver and we barricaded the doors during the riots the night before we fled Damascus. I failed 9th grade in the US because why concentrate on trigonometry when you know everyone else in your 8th grade class is dead? And that's why I want to study international policy. I was due back in school but spent an extra week in Port-au-Prince because bonding with your grandparents is important. The earthquake hit and I had to fight through floods and over dead bodies to get to grandma's house. And I was the one to find her body. That's why I want to study engineering, so I can help build houses that won't fall down and kill people's grandmas. That last one really hit me. I hope they became an engineer and are making progress. This is my husband's story. He taught year 1 in England, so 5-6 years old. He had this really small child who came in a wet uniform to school. This happened several times in the first couple of weeks. Turns out he had only one uniform and his mom would wash it every couple of days but would forget to take it out of the washer, so she would just put him in a wet uniform and send him to school. My husband purchased another uniform, so when he showed up in a wet uniform he had a dry one to put on. Then we would wash the other uniform and dry it for when he needed it. He changed schools after 2 years, but I wonder what happened to that child. You left a name in your post. Had a student commit suicide. Finding out about it was utterly shocking. I saw him a lot in the halls and would say hi as if he was still in my class. He had been struggling a lot but never let anyone know. He was so good at masking the struggle and it was out of left field for me and others, I'm sure. 2 things made the aftermath incredibly hard. One was walking past the casket at the wake. Knowing that he was in there was devastating. Knowing a parent was about to bury their child was devastating. I could not keep it together as I walked past to pay my respects. The other was the sheer number of students that showed up for support was a ton. I had many of them as students at the time or the years prior. I normally offer advice to my students when they ask, and they ask often. It was hard to see them look to me for a response. It was in their faces and the way they looked around and back to me. They had no idea how the grieving process works, as for some it was the first death they dealt with. It was something they needed to figure out themselves and I had nothing I could tell them. All I could do was show up and be present. I make sure to tell my students how important they are to me. Now it means more than ever. I never want to experience that again. When a teacher loses a student like that, it's heartbreaking. I know it seems dumb, but I want my students to feel like they are valued, important, and irreplaceable, because their status as a student teenager doesn't devalue the fact they are people first. If they are struggling, I want them to know I'm there and will always be there to help however I can. No longer a teacher but taught inner city kids, most from Central American countries, all now living in Houston. We had 2 metal detectors to go through just to get to class, and this was a 5th and 6th grade campus. Had one student pregnant from an uncle, she was 12. Had one student who didn't want to go home because they lived in one room of an old trailer in a trailer park. The parents could only afford to rent the one room. Had one student whose mother overdosed with her in the bed and she woke up and found her in the morning. One kid's honor student got suspended for having brass knuckles because he was afraid to walk home. The mail street near the school was called Jail Route instead of Mail Route Road. I lasted teaching 4 years, that was all I could take. One of my previous students had a rough life. He was on the spectrum, so he had difficulty navigating life in general, but man, his home life was bad. His mom got thrown in prison after being caught driving high on M right around Christmas break. Second semester came and he started telling me and his other teachers that he was hearing voices that were telling him to hurt himself. We were horrified and concerned, and alerted our extremely useless counselor, who waited 2 weeks to follow up with him. Turns out dad's been telling the kiddo to fake schizophrenia to get a disability check for him, and we know it's fake because dad was caught doing the exact same thing to the kid's older brother, and the kid even admitted dad's the one who told him what to say and what to do, i.e. draw a very disturbing picture. Last I heard, big brother got into the M game too, so he has zero stability. This poor kid just hasn't had a break. Once had a student who was just so rude all the time. After a few months of school, I finally made enough of an inroad with her to have a good relationship. Over the year we became close. One day she asked me if I knew she was adopted. I did not. Though she told me why she was adopted. When she was a toddler, her parents had her in the car while they were driving around high on drugs. They ended up kidnapping a woman and murdering her in the woods with my student in the backseat of the car. They both went to prison and she was adopted by a family member. My heart was broken for her. She was in therapy, with a loving family, and has a lot of crap to deal with. I can't even imagine what she goes through every day, but I was so touched she shared with me. This was all confirmed at the end of the year by her adopted mother, who thanked me for being a support for her. Working in a toddler room as the teacher, I had a 2-year-old that was just off. Strange behavior, her eyes looked like she hadn't slept in days, and could barely talk. Being from a small town and having some friends that did harder drugs, I knew the name of their dealer. One morning while the mother was dropping off this 2-year-old, she mentioned the drug dealer's name. Something clicked and I reported this with Children's Aid Society. Come to find out, after they took hair samples and did a bunch of other tests on the child, that she was given coke a whole bunch of times to calm her down. Needless to say, the child was taken from the mother and placed in proper care. That my student's mother would wake her up at 11 at night when she got off work to clean her bedroom explained why she slept in my class. She would also have the daughter watch her 5-year-old brother, her 2-year-old brother, and her newborn baby brother, who was a preemie, for hours after she got home from school on the days that her mother did not work, so her mother could have me time. The child begged me to adopt her so I could be her mom. She was 9 years old. This is a daily occurrence for way too many kids. It's so sad. Teaching 1st grade, I had a little girl who would take food from my desk and sometimes from her friends. She would then hide it in her backpack or desk and take it home. When I mentioned it to her foster mom, I found out that in her prior placement she and her twin sister weren't always fed, so when food became available she would hoard it. The mom found food hidden in her room quite often. Once I realized what trauma this child had suffered, I started leaving extra food in my desk for her to take, hoping to relieve a little of her stress once she realized that she could always count on finding something to eat or take home. Not a teacher, but during my 4 years in high school, at least one person died every single February. We called it the February curse and it still messes me up to this day. My freshman year, 2 seniors, one was friends with my brother, both shot themselves in the head within 24 hours of each other, and it was completely unrelated and the worst type of coincidence. My sophomore year, one of my friends died in his sleep with no known pre-existing condition. My junior year, our physics teacher abruptly passed away. My senior year, a freshman was killed in a double homicide-suicide. His dad killed him and his wife and then killed himself, leaving the older sister who was at college without any family left. There were a lot of vigils in those 4 years and the counselors struggled to keep up, especially with kids in my grade. Every the 31st of January, I dread the coming month, and every the 1st of March, I thank God the month is over. My friend had a teacher that just dropped dead in the bathroom one day. I'd care if they ever found out the diagnosis, but she was dead for sure. Not a teacher. In 4th grade I had a bully. Bully is a generous term. He was more like an ashat that didn't like me. One day I found out his parents were abusing him and his whole home situation just sucked. Explained why he was randomly pulled out of class all the time to go to counseling therapy and whatnot. He also had the most ridiculous cartoon villain eyebrows of all time. That 7th grader in my class that had already been held back once. She didn't smell bad because she was big and didn't shower enough. She smelled because her shoes were a mess that were too small for her because her parents couldn't afford to buy her new ones. My homeroom teacher's story. She had a kid who wouldn't do his homework. She would try getting him to do it, having him come to lunch or coming in early. Turns out the kid's family was homeless. She never said if they ever got a home, but hopefully they did. If you don't have a home, you don't have to do homework. New girl, 12 YO, joined the class. Very quiet, not social at all. Heard there were some home issues, but she was a good enough student, no one really thought much of it. Turns out that at some point the girl had been playing with her baby brother near the pool. The girl opened the pool gate while they were playing and then got distracted or something and went inside for a bit. When she came out, the baby had fallen in the pool and drowned. Mother got hardcore depressed. Obviously, couldn't love the girl, which I can understand, I guess, but god dang, that little girl must be so full of pain believing she murdered her brother and her mother blaming her for it. Student's perspective. I was beaten often as a kid, 12, by my mother's husband, not my dad. He was a real angry bastard and very violent. I went to school one day after getting a hiding a few days before. I was sore and bruised and walking a bit wonky donkey. My teacher, Neville Jones, Rotorua, John Paul College, Edmund Rice College, knew I was not a happy chappy, and when I walked into class he gave me a hug and told me that it wasn't my fault, and that I'd be okay. This was 32 odd years ago. I swear he was misty-eyed. I'll never forget him. Thanks, Mr. Jones. And you were right. I'm okay. God, where to even start? I saw another comment about how casual kids are about their trauma, and I absolutely concur. It's always something when a kid raises his hand during class discussion to blurt that his mom was 13 when she had him, or that their brother died at 9 years old. I had one boy who showed me the news headline about the motorcycle accident that killed his father. His mother was in prison for drug use and child abuse. She used to beat him and his sister, and he told me he remembered when he used to be unsure of the next time he'd eat or have electricity. His dad saved him and his sister from their mom, but then tragically died when the boy was only 10 or 11. He's doing a lot better now, but the other kids have no idea about his situation, so he gets picked on a lot. BC, he's a little emotionally unstable and it breaks my heart. Sometimes I don't even know what I can do for this kids, so I just have to pour as much love into them as I can in the short 10 months we get to spend together. But sometimes it keeps me up at night when I think about all the tears that have landed on my desks and shoulder and all the pain I've seen in their young eyes. Since I became a teacher in 2012, I've always been open about my own experiences in school, and let's just say they haven't been the best. I've been bullied, refusing to go to school, actually not having to go to school for 2 years, and so on. Being that open has led to many students opening up to me. In one school, a lot of the students would rather go to me than to the school counselor. This of course has led to students sharing stuff I've not always been comfortable with, but at the same time it feels so good to be that person students can actually talk to. I know I've made a difference to some students' life, and that is all that matters in the end. I teach at a prep after school private school. I had a 7-year-old girl who was in foster care. She was taken out of her home around 1-2 because her parents being drug addicts, and she was often left in her own filth. She was changed 2-3 times before I met her. She was a bit entitled, but she was an overall good kid. Worst of all, I had a preschool who has known this girl since the girl was 1. The girl loved the teacher and often believed that the teacher would adopt her one day, but the girl's foster mom decided the school sucked and withdrew the girl with no notice. I hope this little girl does okay in life. I've currently got one student staying in a domestic violence shelter with his mom and another whose parents are in and out of jail for drugs. Of previous students, one was obsessed with cancer because his younger brother died of brain cancer. Another found his father's dead body as a young child and was still struggling psychologically. A gang member who was bright and caring but didn't feel like he had any options. It's hard to pick one. A student hurting herself, pinching her legs and cutting her arms because she needed an outlet for mental pain. Turns out mother was emotionally abusive. These threads like this, that discuss a kid's personal tragedies, they never mention how even after hearing about such things the school employees still demand that the kids see busy work and other school related nonsense as life or death levels of importance. Your house burning down is no excuse for sloppy handwriting or sorry your whole family died, but make sure you show your work on those math problems. Facts lol, I had teachers get pee at me when I came back to school from the psych ward without all my homework done. It was almost funny, but not quite cause I wasn't ready to laugh about anything yet. One of my students came to school on a PD day. He lives with dad and he forgot. We called dad but no answer. Same with stepmom who dad lived with. So we tried bio mom. She answers the phone. Hi, is this Joanne, Caleb's mom? Mom says yes it is. We say we have Caleb at school but there are no students today. Can you come pick him up or can we drop him off? We can't get a hold of dad. Bio mom the lies, pretends not to be who she already said she was and says she doesn't know Caleb. Luckily he didn't hear this and the secretary drove him to stepmom's house where she was home with little sister. He was such a sweet kid too. I think of him often. Not real names obviously. I'm not sure if I'll ever top this one. This is high school. I came back from summer break and confronted a student from last year about how I thought I saw her a couple of weeks back. I asked, was that your mom walking with you? She shook her head and didn't say anything. I found out from her older brother the next day both their parents had passed away during the summer, and no one on staff had heard yet. Over the course of the next 2 years her mood slowly improved again, and it made me very happy when I finally saw her smiling and laughing again with her friends. The parents were fighting over who had him post-divorce. In the horrid way, I don't want him, you take him etc. Sad thing is that wasn't the heartbreaker. That was hearing them argue the other way over his sister because she's the good one. You can't take her from me. In front of him. And often after he had just been shunted from house to house again. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.